Welcome to the Exodus Cry podcast, where we have honest conversations around exploitation, trafficking, sexual culture, and justice.
Hello and welcome back to the Exodus Cry podcast. Today we are interviewing Dr. Caroline Heldman, who is a professor of critical theory and social justice at Occidental College in Los Angeles. She's also the executive director of the Representation Project and a political commentator for Spectrum and CNN International. Dr. Heldman has published 6 books on gender justice and politics, and her work has been featured in numerous documentaries, including our own films Liberated, The New Sexual Revolution, and Raised on Porn. Among her many accomplishments, she led the End Rape Statute of Limitations that successfully abolished the time limit on prosecuting rape in California. Really interesting episode. Thank you so much for watching.
So we sat down and talked when I was making a film called Liberated, The New Sexual Revolution. And I just found your insights about sexual objectification and culture to be super helpful in helping to provide a lens and a framework for that film. Because a lot of what we were looking at was what's happening in the culture related to the representation of women that is being put out there and the image of women that is being promoted through mass media today. And then trying to understand what impact that's having on the socialization of females in our culture. And so maybe that's a good place for us to start and just to kind of get caught up. I would love to hear kind of what you've been working on and what you've been thinking about related to this issue since that last time that we talked, which, man, that was some years ago now. And, but you know, we're still in this heavily saturated media culture where these images seem to continue to dominate the pop culture. Images of objectified, highly sexualized, hypersexualized females that then plays a significant role in the socialization of younger females and the impact of that. Are there some things that you've been staring at lately that would maybe give us a more updated look at kind of what you've been seeing?
Yeah, so my work has focused for a long time on women's sexual objectification and how we've made that completely normal in society. And so just for a little foundation, we tend to value men based upon their prestige, their occupation, their income, which is not meritorious per se, but at least it's something that you have some control over, versus how we value girls and women, which is primarily our appearance and our body, right? So we raise, as Sarah Mernon puts it, we raise our little boys to view their bodies as these tools to master their environment. And we raise little girls to view their bodies as projects to be worked on that are constantly under construction. You're never good enough. And that's your primary worth. So it doesn't matter what a woman accomplishes in the world, right? Whether she is a presidential candidate, a vice president, a senator, a CEO, she can immediately be reduced to nothing with a comment about her appearance. And so it tells us a lot about women's primary value in our culture. And so it wouldn't be such an issue if it weren't dehumanizing, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the reason we're talking about this is because women's sexual objectification and the acceptance and the embrace of it from everyone in our culture is really at the heart of violence against women, because dehumanization of a group is the very first step in violence against that group. So it is no wonder that 1 in 3 women will face some form of sexual or other domestic violence over the course of her lifetime. We simply do not view women as full human subjects. And I think when we look at sexual objectification, that's really at the heart of that. And the reason that it's dehumanizing, I think there's a lot of theoretical arguments, there's a lot of data, but the reason that it's dehumanizing is because objectification is the process of taking a living thing and making it an object that you can act upon or benefits you in some way. So sexual objectification is the process of viewing a human being as an object who exists for you, for your sexual pleasure. And so when we're surrounded by literally thousands of images of women's objectified bodies constantly in film, television, video games, the side of a bus, we leave our houses, we're immediately seeing these images. Everyone in the culture is constantly being reminded that women are sex objects. And when we think about, the power dynamics here, we're simplifying the world by viewing it in terms of subjects and objects. So sexual subjects act and sexual objects are acted upon. So we're being surrounded by these images where we're being reminded of women and girls as sex objects, and they are forever being acted upon. That is a dehumanizing position to be in. It's a subordinate position to be in. And so as little girls, we learn that our value comes from our bodies, and we do everything we can to maximize our status as a sex object. But even if we're the most valuable sex object, we are still subordinate to sexual subjects. And who gets the message that they're a sexual subject? Men get that message. They get it from advertising, showing them half-naked bodies of women. They get it in porn. They get it in video games. They get it in terms of messages about how they're supposed to be consuming women, right? The idea of racking up the number of women you've slept with. I mean, we're talking about heterosexual men here. All of that is aimed toward reminding them that they're sexual subjects. So this has everything to do with power. It has everything to do with gendered power, the dehumanization of girls and women, and ultimately it has to do with sexual violence, because that's where this lands us.
I think that's a really interesting connection, and the connection between objectification and violence, because it does elevate the stakes of this conversation to a higher and more urgent level. And I remember learning for the first time what was behind the Swedish law that was really attempting to eradicate trafficking in their country. And for those of us who have been involved with the anti-trafficking movement for a while are very familiar with what was first called the Swedish model, then the Nordic model is now referred to as the abolition model or the equality model. It's all the same legislation, which is legislation that criminalizes the purchase of sex at a felony level offense, and then decriminalizes the people being sold for sex, recognizing the vulnerability of their position and offering them programs and services and housing, things to get help, to help remove those vulnerabilities. So this legislation became a point of focus for us as we were looking at the problem of the global crisis of sex trafficking and just seeing how effective this legislation was in Sweden. Well, at one point along the way, we found out from, I believe it was the National Rapporteur Against Trafficking in Sweden, who gave us the insight that it started with a project to end men's violence against women. And what a lot of people will be triggered just by that statement alone. There's a lot going on in our culture right now. There's a side that casts all men as bad and evil and all masculinity is awful and toxic. And then there's a reactionary counter movement to that is, just sensitive towards anything that would be critical of men and, yada, yada. And I think, like anything, there's so much more complexity to this conversation than just these really polarized camps that have been created around this, but just acknowledging that it's real. Men's violence against women is still a major global pandemic. It's epidemic proportions of violence, men's violence against women. In Sweden, they decided to take this very seriously. And what they realized is we can't solve the problem of men's violence against women unless we address this industry of prostitution that really creates an environment where that is happening all the time. And whether it's accepted or not, it's just, there's so much violence that happens in prostitution. And so so for us, that was like a really interesting connection. And I appreciate that perspective that you're providing, because there are some people out there who would maybe say, well, what's the problem with a little bit of objectification? Don't we all just want to look good anyway? There's a lot of ways to rationalize that and to explain away what might be a perceived consequence of that mindset. But the deeper truth here that you're getting at is that it's directly connected with men's violence against women. I think that's such an important point to make. And it's a difficult point to make, but it's one that we need to sit with, especially as males, not being immediately reactionary and defensive and assuming that some narrative has been built against us, but just acknowledging this is a problem. And there's a deeper, more insidious process of socialization going on in our culture that is contributing towards this issue of men's violence against women being at epidemic levels of proportions around the world. Is there anything more that you would add to help illuminate this idea of objectification, dehumanization, and connected with oftentimes the violence that women experience in our culture? And I'm going to stop there, but I think at some point we should talk about the studies done so people can actually quantify the levels of violence that we're talking about. But I think, I've given you a bit of a runway here, so we can hit that first and then.
Well, and that's a great question, right? So there's so many links between objectification and violence. I think the neuroscience speaks volumes here, right? So we know that this emerging body of work around what happens in the brain when you see when men are looking at images of sexually objectified women. What we know from Heflick and Goldenberg's studies, for example, we know that when you view a sex object, you care less about her pain and suffering. And I should say it actually extends beyond men. When we sexually objectify a woman, we care less about her pain and suffering, which that would lead to dehumanization and violence against her. We also know that when people see images of sexually objectified women, that they see them as a collection of body parts rather than a full human. Again, dehumanization. One study, we know that when men see sexually objectified images of women, the same part of their brain lights up as when they're going to use a tool, a hammer or a saw. And so they're, again, a dehumanization or a use of another human being as an object. So it is not surprising to me that there is a link when you look at the neuroscience behind it, that there's a link between objectification and violence. There's also a lot of internalized oppression and violence that happens when you are a girl or a woman raised in a society that asks you to be a sex object. We know that the more you internalize the idea of being a sex object, the higher your rates of body hatred and shame, of eating disorders, of depression, the lower your GPA, the lower your ambition, the lower your idea that your voice matters in politics, the less likely you are to be involved in politics, the less likely you are to want to be a leader. So there are all of these very negative things that are associated too through now almost 3 decades of studies on what we call self-objectification. And I'll just call out that term. I don't love the term self-objectification because it makes it seem like girls and women do it to themselves. But at the end of the day, what is happening is the culture is sending us very clear messages and teaching us about gender roles, and girls and women are learning this. Just like boys and men are learning, heterosexual boys and men especially are learning that they're supposed to objectify girls and women. So, women open up women's magazines, we see sexually objectified images, and it teaches us how to be the ideal sex object. Men open up magazines, whether for them or turn on the TV or watch, play a video game, watch a film, and they're constantly getting the message that girls and women exist for them. And so when we look at this, I think it's really important to take a step back and say, this is the culture. If we have a broad trend like this is not individual people or men being bad, behaving badly. This is actually boys being acculturated into a society that teaches them that this is their role. Their role is to be the great validator of other men and their worth, and they're being taught that their role is to also validate girls and women based upon their bodies, and that's their job. And so the number of times, I've interacted with men who are trying to validate me or say something about my body and interrupting that social script, I would say the biggest reaction is shock, because they just don't know. And it's not to say they can't be better people and learn this, but that's not what the culture is teaching them. And so I think we need to look very specifically at what porn and every other form of media, video games, are teaching us about boys and men. And I will say, in the decade or so since we've spoken deeply about this issue, we have a teen mental health crisis. And it's a gendered crisis, and it's one that's being driven by social media. It's being driven by images of perfection. So it's not enough, for girls to learn that their most valuable asset and their value and worth comes from their bodies. They're also being exposed to even more impossible standards of beauty with filters, and constantly having to live this double life where they are projecting an image through social media, and they're being asked to project an image through social media of absolute perfection. And they are seeing images of absolute perfection. And given that this is how we are supposed to be derived, this is where we derive our value from, it is no surprise to me that we see incredible anxiety over dress and appearance. The Facebook study, the internal Facebook study, the whistleblower, Frances Haugen, who came forward and presented data saying, look, when teen girls spend time on social media, it has profound effects on their well-being. It is not a surprise. What's happened in the culture is all of these cultural messages we've been getting for decades since the rise of mass media have become more amplified, and the gendered notions have become far more kind of piercing, narrow, and prevalent because they're being delivered directly to you through algorithms.
Are there specific examples of things that you can think of right now in the culture that would embody kind of the representation of what you're saying, that would embody the ideas of objectification and hypersexualization that are being so widely promoted? And then are there any examples that you can think of where we're making progress?
I think social media is a double-edged sword, right? Mm-hmm. Where we are getting ideas about empowerment, and they are going viral, and we have tools. So we have the rise of influencers who are talking very much about body positivity. They're pushing back against fat phobia. They're pushing back against this idea that everybody has to be, just this cookie cutter image. So certainly these conversations are taking place. By the way, I think that fighting against fat phobia and using body as the standard for our worth, that whole fight, I think, is our kind of next frontier of social justice work. So I see a lot of positive in that. I can think of, scores of examples of the easy access, for example, to, I'm almost reluctant to talk about this, but these extreme, weight loss procedures, whether they're surgical or whether they're, activities that young women are taking into consideration. They're learning how to starve themselves. They're learning how to, they're learning that it is important to get surgery, for example. So we see rates of surgery to especially, breast augmentation and nose jobs. We have seen rates skyrocket for young people. It used to be that surgery, that plastic surgery was primarily performed on the biggest kind of market was middle-aged women. That is not what we're seeing anymore. We are learning that augmentation, surgical augmentation, so that your real life person matches the filters that you're using, I think is really troubling evidence. But we also see a rise too of the sexualization. I'm going to sound like a prude here, but a lot of shows, and I don't know if I even need to name names to advance this, but we see the sexualization of teens like we've never seen before, under the guise of kind of sexual empowerment of teens. And my issue, and I guess I'll mention a show like Euphoria. I can watch Euphoria and I can say to myself, this is super positive in terms of looking at lots of gender representations and freedom and young people finding their way. And I also imagine like a 37-year-old dude watching this show, and I think that it is normalizing something that is really not positive in our culture. And so I think while social media is really opening up conversations, and we see streaming content that's a lot more maybe gender inclusive and sexual LGBTQ plus and inclusive along those lines, I'm also really troubled by the younger ages of the normalization of sexualization that we're seeing in mainstream media, essentially the pornification of mainstream media, which that's a long-term trend. We all know the market dynamics of this, that as we have seen more pornification of mainstream media content, porn proper has become more violent and more degrading in order to differentiate itself from mainstream media. And when you can't tell the difference, right, between a show you're seeing on HBO because they're hiring a lot of porn performers because they have to, because that's what the content is, and old school porn, then porn itself is shifting. So we see this addiction model moving its way into mainstream media. And then, of course, porn becoming far more violent and far more degrading than it has ever been. It reminds me of watching wrestling. It's not your parents' wrestling, right? There's just the porn content has worked its way into everything. And one last thing I'll say about kind of the rise of streaming and online, just easy access to everything, is that when we talk about media representation and we talk about impact on the culture, we used to talk about film and TV. Those were the biggest markets. They are no longer the biggest markets. Porn and video games are, and yet we have very little focus. I mean, we need to treat porn, when we're talking about media representation, we need to treat porn like the number one form of learning and teaching about the culture, because in terms of hours and numbers, it has now exceeded, and video games as well, exceeded film and TV in terms of consumption numbers.
Right, because there's concern for some of these mainstream shows and their depiction of teenagers in very graphic settings. There's a concern there. And I think for a lot of people, that's kind of where they see the problem, is like in some of these more graphic shows. But it's interesting just hearing what you just shared, because when you actually look at the numbers of hours that people are spending consuming media content, porn far surpasses anything. And that's a very disturbing picture when you actually get into that world and discover what it is there that people are consuming. And it's just unbridled, no holds barred violence, every graphic, violent, insidious fantasy being played out in real time upon real people. And what is that doing? So just kind of taking an inventory for all of this, I always so appreciate how articulate and knowledgeable you are about framing up kind of what we're dealing with, what people are, especially young people, are dealing with right now in our culture. How do you direct this message, this understanding, to young adults in a way that they can receive and begin to wrestle with? And then how do you direct it towards parents to try to, I guess where my mind goes is, these trends are very troublesome to me. And I would love to kind of discuss some ways to push back against these trends. And so how do we reach young adults with this understanding? Because there's so much pressure on them just to conform, to fit in, to be cool, to be part of, to belong, all of that. And then to parents, they're stressed, they're juggling so many things. They're overwhelmed. They can't relate because, there was Playboy when they grew up, and now it's all this other stuff online. Have you thought about how we can direct this message, this understanding to these two different groups of people?
Yeah, another great question. I think for parents, one of the things that I try to convey is it actually doesn't matter what you do, short of getting a cabin, moving out into the woods, and having no internet.
It's not a bad idea.
That's a possibility. That's sort of how
There's
I was raised.
There's going to be a booming cabin market coming soon.
Exactly, right? But then, of course, Wi-Fi is coming, right?
Right.
If you're a parent, you actually can't control what your kid is going to see. We all remember what we were like as kids. Now add technology. We snuck out at night. I snuck out at night.
Yeah.
I should say, I got access to things I wasn't supposed to get access to. I was trying things and experimenting with things all the time. Now add technology to that. Kids are not only more tech savvy than their parents, but it's pretty easy to go to school and get access to things from your friends and online, finding ways to get access to phones that may have been locked up or laptops or you name the technology. So I think giving parents that kind of assurance that they actually can't control the messaging, that their children are going to get it at some point. And maybe you can delay it for a few years, which would be great. But short of homeschooling and really restricting access to technology or, again, moving out into a cabin, I don't see that that's really a possibility for most parents. So the answer for me is media literacy, really sitting down with them and going through, and there are lots of programs that are available online, National Media Literacy Association, the Representation Project, which I run. We have a lot of resources, right, for being critical consumers of media, asking whose agenda is being pushed, who is creating this, what the messaging is, what the layers of messaging are, and how it may be impacting you. So I think that it would be great for all of us to get more media literacy training, but certainly young people. And in terms of young people, I think the challenge in terms of talking about these issues is that consumerism has won. This idea that, in order to be sex positive, you can't call out things that are really negative about sex or scary about sex or demeaning or degrading or sexist. So I think, the radical feminists of the 1970s who talked about objectification have by and large been silenced. And what I find is it takes a lot of courage to go into rooms of feminists and say, I actually don't find, you could objectify yourself all you want, just don't tell me it's feminist. Don't tell me it's advancing anything for women, because I know what power is and I know what empowerment is, and that's not what this looks like. We know it has profoundly negative effects on girls and women in terms of their well-being. There are, almost 30 years of studies on this. We know that it has negative effects with the neuroscience, and also just, as someone who's rational about this, it doesn't feel empowering. I know what power is. That's not what power is. I'll know it when I see it, and that's not it. But that's controversial, right? Because then you're being sex negative and this idea of sex positivity. But the funny thing is, sexual objectification is linked to less sexual pleasure. We know that the more you self-objectify, the less sex you're having and the less pleasurable sex. So for me, reaching young people, I think there's a great need and a hunger to talk about this, especially with young women, also young men. I teach classes on sexuality. I can tell you there's a hunger because they are not happy. They're not having good and pleasurable sex. And there's a question about what role sexual objectification plays in this. And I will say that a new trend, so So pornography is the primary sex educator for our young people. And the students that I've had in the past 5 years have come in and have been sharing information with me, which tells me that porn has shifted and porn culture has shifted sexual practices. So choking, hitting, slapping, spanking, non-consensual, sudden, shocking actions that are taking place in heterosexual sexual interactions that are coming from porn, that is what is driving this, are really scary to a lot of heterosexual young women. And I know this because I ask them to share anonymously with me what their sexual experiences are, what their fears are, what their questions are. And in the past 5 years, questions about non-consensual choking have come up so often. And of course, now I'm looking at data and I'm seeing that, almost 100 women died in the last few years in a study out of the UK related to new sexual practices from pornography.
Wow.
And so I look at this and I say, there's a hunger here. And I finally published my book, The Sexy Lie, The War on Women's Bodies and How to Fight Back. And it has a lot of information about this. And I think, to your question, it's really hard to have a real conversation about this without being shushed and silenced by people who think that it's not sex positive.
Right.
But it's a conversation we need to have because people are actually suffering. They're afraid to have sex. They're afraid to get into a situation where they might be choked without their consent because their partner has learned something in porn that doesn't make sense. And it used to be, that to be crass, it used to be that the thing that young women were worried about was men ejaculating on their face without their permission, because that was a really popular trend in porn, still is a popular trend in porn. But facials used to be the thing they're worried about a decade ago. Now they're worried about getting choked.
That is so disturbing. Understanding just kind of the evolution of human sexuality as something directly affected by the evolution of porn. And I think, like, as you were talking, where my mind was going was, who's making money from this? Because it really, at some level, it feels like there's a financial interest in the current evolution and trajectory of human sexuality and this very appearance-based culture that we live in. For example, like when you first began sharing about some of the pressures that particularly young women face to measure up to a certain look. Well, thanks to a lot of the work that you guys have been doing at the Representation Project, but others as well, we now can see that this huge market has emerged, not just for makeup and cosmetics, but also for plastic surgery. And so here's an image that actually nobody looks like. And this is supposed to be the image that makes you look empowered, liberated. You have the look that's celebrated, that creates visibility for you, whatever that look is. Well, how are you going to get there? So that disparity then has created this, you would probably know the numbers better than I would, but this massive industry for plastic surgery, all the cosmetic stuff. I just actually saw something in a news article. It was the New York Post was quoting Kylie Jenner as saying that though she had breast augmentation surgery at 19, would be heartbroken if her daughter had it at 19. And so for my point is not to criticize or shame or stigmatize anyone who has had any work done, but just to say that where is that coming from? There may be some kind of like autonomous, existential desire to maintain and preserve a youthful look or whatever. Fine. But the staggering numbers and the younger ages that we're seeing that with. So just on that level, it feels like there's a financial interest in creating this widespread insecurity that then people need to go out and do certain things. I'm curious, like in the work that you've done, if you see other financially motivating factors, like who's to gain from these trends that are so obviously detrimental to our mental, physical, relational, biopsychosocial health as individuals and as a society?
The health and beauty industry is $60 billion a year. There are many industries within that category that exist because we hate our bodies, or we view our bodies as these projects we just constantly have to work on. And it is remarkable. Men are not left behind, right? Marketers are definitely, health and beauty industries are going after men as well. They're not having the same level of success because men have other ways in which they're primarily valued in our culture. But you hit the nail on the head. It's this gap between where you think you are and where you think you need to be. And that's where all of the media come in, the advertising comes in, the goalpost of where you think you need to be. The bigger that gap, the more you are going to buy. Whether it is a surgical procedure or procedures, makeup, clothing, however you're presenting yourself, fitness, services. I want to live in a world where we're not evaluated based upon our bodies.
Yeah.
80% of our body size is genetic, which means that if you're fat, and I don't use that as an insult, I use it as a descriptive term. I'm part of a growing movement of people who are using fat as a descriptive term in order to say, look, it's just a body type. 80% is determined genetically, which means that if we set up a culture, and you're really speaking to the broader cultural strain here, right, or the pressure. If we set up a culture where your body is the most important thing about you, and you're not valued if you are in a fat body, and 80% of your body size is determined by genetics, we are setting up a culture that is inherently unfair. I would argue it's inherently unfair economically as well. When you have people who have certain access, for example, to having surgeries that then make you more valuable as a body. It also, is highly raced. We have for women, we have, the thin, blonde, standard European white standard of beauty, which ends up excluding women of color by and large. And so you set up these hierarchies in terms of value when we place value on bodies. I want to move away from that. I want to live in a culture where there is no pressure for anyone to get surgery, which puts them at risk. I mean, Kanye West's mother died from surgery. People die from plastic surgery. It's not a large number, but why are we going through invasive surgeries in order to capitulate to a system of value that ultimately, we could all reject? And you bring up a really good point about not blaming individual people, women or people who've gotten breast augmentation surgery or any type of surgery or spending money and time on this. They are not the problem. Right? The problem is the system. When we see hundreds of thousands of breast augmentations now being given as a matter of course as graduation gifts are happening each year in the United States, we have to look at that and say, hey, that's not an individual problem, that's a cultural problem. And if we want to live in a world where people can just be in their bodies without getting invasive surgeries that put their health at risk, right? Which all surgeries do, then we need to view it as a cultural issue. And that's coming from the health and beauty industry, and it's so many industries within that are making billions of dollars off of our dissatisfaction.
Yeah, because the irony of it is, well, this is going to make you more sexually appealing, which if you're on like a social scoring point system is like one of the highest ways to excel in our culture is to be sexually appealing. The irony of it is that those measures that predominantly young females are being pressured to conform to is also going to compromise their ability to experience sexual pleasure. So the very thing that's supposed to create sexual attraction is actually reducing their ability to experience sexual pleasure, which to me is so revealing because it says this isn't really about sexual health.
That's right.
That's not what this is about. It's not about sexual health, and it's not about an authentically. It's not about authentically celebrating who women are. It's about creating an image patterned after a script that has been created by a handful of people in the San Fernando Valley pumping out all of these porn videos. It's so crazy to me. I watched a documentary that talks about the phenomenon of some of the different surgeries that females are being pressured to look like these people in porn. And it was so heartbreaking and disturbing to learn about the ways that their physical bodies are being compromised and their ability to actually have sexual satisfaction is being compromised by these same surgeries. And so for me, that really just, it poses this deeper question for us as a society to wrestle with, which is, what is the end of all this? What are the governing ethical standards that we are measuring our lives by at this moment in history that would cause us to become so preoccupied and obsessed with compromising our own physical bodies to achieve a certain look? Those are some of the things that are just like coming up for me as we consider all this and wrestle with all this. Have you thought about that dynamic of you would probably be able to speak to it a lot better than I would, but watching this documentary was just so revealing to me.
It is truly disturbing how surgeries meant to make you a better sex object actually diminish your sexual pleasure. So vagioplasty, which is meant to tidy up your vulva and your vagina so that you can look like a porn performer, reduces sexual pleasure. It reduces sexual sensitivity of the vulva. Having breast augmentation reduces the sensitivity of your nipples. Let's be clear about it. Getting these surgeries to be a better sex object, to be a more valuable sex object, reduces your sexual pleasure. We also know that breast augmentation causes rates of clinical depression to increase after surgeries, not decrease. So there's a lot of myths about what these surgeries are going to do in terms of well-being and happiness and sexual pleasure. We also know that the more that you view yourself as a sex object, the less pleasure you have during the sexual act, and probably because of higher rates of habitual body monitoring, which is just constantly thinking about how your body looks and being away from the actual sexual pleasure in the act itself, because you're viewing yourself from a third position, a spectatorship position, essentially. And so it is remarkable how all of these things that we say are about sex are not about sexual pleasure for women particularly. But you bring up another great question about the ethics and how we got here. Mm-hmm. And obviously there is a capitalist incentive for the diet, beauty, fitness industries, right? The porn industry is running, as we know, on an addiction model where they are using more violence and more degradation to get you hooked, just like video games are running on an addiction model. So the content is getting more extreme in terms of violence and degradation, to the point where we have the mainstream gonzo porn, the fastest growing, most popular form of pornography, has incredible rates of violence. About 90% contain some sort of verbal aggression or violence, and about half has physical violence. And we know that when you watch this porn, men who watch this porn are desensitized to the pain and suffering of women. They're more likely to, a recent study found, they're more likely to animalize women, meaning to treat them. I would say the study uses the term animalization. I would use the term dehumanization, that you view women as being there for you sexually and in an object form, and not being a full human being. Mm-hmm. And I can't use that language enough. Like, we train our men to not view women to be full full human beings in their eyes. We also, train when we're looking at masculinity, there are many positive forms of masculinity. But when we look at the most common type of masculinity, we're talking about traditional or what I would call toxic masculinity, because we raise our little boys to not have some organic form of masculinity. We actually raise them to reject everything that is feminine. Don't cry like a girl, don't throw like a girl, don't be like a girl. And so we have this very kind of reactionary form of masculinity where we ask boys to reject everything that is feminine. And then we wonder why we raise them to not view women as full human beings. I actually call it the great setup, right? Boys cannot possibly view women as full human beings when they grow up if they don't critically analyze and reject the messages that they've gotten about their masculinity. With that said, I would love to move away from gender roles entirely, away from femininity and masculinity, and look at ethical standards and take what I love about kind of traditional masculinity, which is being a protector, being courageous, being a rescuer. I would like everyone to embrace those qualities.
Sure.
For femininity, it's the empathy and the caring which we ascribe to women, which is actually we're just talking about elevating certain emotions and certain approaches that exist in all human beings.
Yes.
So I would love to disconnect them from men and women. I would love to elevate them as kind of universal organizing principles, because I think that we individualize. So how do we get here, right? That big question. We know what the market incentives are. We know what the culture is teaching us. But how is it that otherwise good people can be engaged in really bad acts? And I think of something Robert Jensen said in his book, Getting Off Men and the Pornography and the End of Men, looking at the idea that not all orgasms are good. If you are orgasming to awful images of child or violence, or not all orgasms are good. So how is it that you get otherwise good men who are engaging in essentially bad acts through porn or these other avenues? And I think it's because it's an individual act that is done in secret and it's done in private, and it's something that they've been asked to do and it's been offered to them in a culture that has normalized this to a certain extent, and it's incentivized through these market incentives. But really we need to look at the individual acts which then collectively become our culture, right? And we need to address the fact that individual acts have societal consequences. It's not just something that is happening in your private space. And I would love to just make that a public conversation, because ultimately what we're talking about are millions of individual acts that are being driven by really disturbing market incentives that don't have any morality, right? Markets are amoral. They're not, but they're making very immoral. They're producing very immoral environments that are creating a culture that makes it really dangerous for certain folks to live in. And I don't want to live in that world. I want to live in a different world.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought up the male side of the equation. Like, how are young females experiencing this culture? We've talked a lot about that. And then also, how are young males experiencing this culture as well? And that raises a question for me that I would love to hear your perspective on. We have done as much research on Andrew Tate and investigation of him as probably anyone, or more than anyone. And because of some things that we began to hear him say that sounded like trafficking activity. And so talking about barricading himself in a large compound in Romania where he forces women to live and has, 10 plus passports for multinational travel, and avoiding, trying to create some kind of immunity for himself and avoiding law enforcement. He started to say all these things and having girls work online, prostituting themselves. I started to think, whoa, wait a minute. This person who has been held up and valorized for all these, views about traditional masculinity is also living a life that is very questionable, and then came to discover is appears to be trafficking, and himself is a self-proclaimed pimp, and talks about the book that he read on pimping to help develop his ideas and approach to pimping. So my question is, what's happening right now in the culture among young males that is giving rise to somebody like Andrew Tate? Here for us, we've been fighting sex trafficking for close to 17 years. And we have made some comments about Andrew Tate just sounding the alarm on some of these more disturbing things that he has said. And people who have been avid followers and supporters of ours have reacted in disgust, not at Andrew Tate, but at us for saying them. Things like just simply cutting together reels of his own comments, implicating himself. But now there's this deep sensitivity and reactionary emotion around even questioning somebody like that. What that tells me is there's this growing allegiance to people like him that they cannot even grapple with the reality of the truth of who he really is. And so for me, that really raises this question of, doing all the work that you do, looking at the culture and on the trends in culture and pop culture, music and television and porn and all these things, what do you see happening in the culture right now that is giving rise to somebody like Andrew Tate?
I think you get Andrew Tate when two things collide. One is a backlash against the gains that women have made in our culture. You can look at it socially, politically, economically. As much as women are still far behind men in all of those spheres when it comes to value, wages, et cetera, we've made a lot of progress since the second wave of the feminist movement, which is now about 50 years old, right? Half a century old. And so anytime you see a shift in the social order, a true shift in the social order, you will see a backlash against that. Because what you're talking about is, anytime you're talking about a social order, you're talking about existing power dynamics and folks who benefit from those systems. And so you have the collision of the backlash, I think, with another key part which allows Andrew Tates of the world to rise up, and that is online, social media, right? So you see the backlash happening in real time on social media. You see the rise of what's been called the manosphere, right? Which is this celebration of kind of the most toxic aspects of masculinity. And again, I don't think there's anything set in stone about masculinity or femininity. I think we make way too much. We act like they exist in nature when they don't. We know this because like the founding fathers, 250 years ago were the height of masculinity, and they were wearing stockings and heels and wigs and face powder, and you look at even at the 70s. I mean, it shifts so radically. Look at the ideas of like disco dancers. The hypermasculine men in the 70s are not what hypermasculine men are today. It varies by culture. It varies over time, which tells you it's a social construct, and that means that we can recreate it however we would like. So what is happening is, as girls and women are making progress in our culture and globally, we are seeing a big pushback against that. And what we're also seeing is a lot of men who are susceptible to messaging from men like Andrew Tate. It's a spectrum, right, of men who have major platforms who are speaking to men, millions of followers, who are hearing their message and it's resonating with them because they don't know their place in the culture. So to be empathetic toward men who may be susceptible to these messages, the culture is shifting. They don't know what their place is in the culture as women are coming more into their own. The place of men gets upset and it gets unsettled. Also, anytime you have a position of power, you don't want to give that up. And I don't want to be naive about like what it would take to actually get gender equality in our culture. I think if I'm a man and I'm raised to believe that I matter more than women and 50% of the population, and I'm taught through all of these messages of objectification that women exist for me and my sexual pleasure, and I walk through the world this way, and all of a sudden I'm being told that my place is in jeopardy or I'm not entitled to that, I might have what Michael Kimmel has called aggrieved entitlement. I might feel like, wait, I'm entitled to this and yet I'm not getting this. And then you see the rise of the incels, right? These involuntary celibate men, but it's a spectrum. You get these men who to be empathetic toward them, feel like their place in the world isn't set. Now, again, they do feel, some of them, very entitled, and that entitlement doesn't have any basis in reality and needs to be interrogated. But I understand why this is happening. My message to young men or men in general who might be hearing these messages is to say that if you truly believe in fairness and equality, and you wouldn't want to be treated that way, then don't listen to this steady diet of folks who are gonna feed into your aggrieved entitlement. Take a step back, turn off that spigot, because it's a spigot of hate.
Yeah.
Even if it's coming in a soft, gentle form, it still is promoting a lack of respect and ultimately kind of a core hatred against girls and women. And it's just not healthy. It's actually not the way to find your place in the world. The way to find your place in the world is to interrogate what you feel you're entitled to, where you're getting those messages from, how you would want to be treated if you weren't in the body that you are in, whether it has to do with race or gender, ability, sexuality, age, body size. Think about how you would want to be treated if you were not in a position of privilege, whatever specific privilege you have. And then imagine a world. I think the political imaginary is so important here. Imagine, that's a fancy way of saying, imagine a world that you would want to live in, and then work your way toward getting there.
Hi guys, this is Benji Nolot from Exodus Cry, and I'm just so excited to announce the release of my new book called Raised on Porn. This is something that I've been working on for the past 10 years and just excited to get it into your hands to help deepen your understanding of porn, its impact on our world, on our lives, and what we can do to heal from it. And so I think you're going to find this to be an extremely insightful and helpful resource, whether you are somebody who is struggling with porn consumption, whether you're a parent and wanting to help have better conversations with your kids and protect your kids, whether you're an educator, whether you're in a relationship and this has in some way affected your relationship. I think this book's gonna be a super helpful resource. I wrote it in such a way to be that resource that I wish was there when I started into this. So it's both comprehensive and in-depth. And if you're looking for a one-stop shop, so to speak, I think this is that book that you can get a hold of that's really going to give you the big picture and an in-depth way of how porn is affecting our world and us as individuals and our relationships and our children. And again, what we can do to heal, to find freedom, to better our society. And so I encourage you, get a hold of this book, Raised on Porn, and share it with a friend as well. Thanks so much. This idea of men not knowing their place in the world in a shifting sociological landscape has given rise to people, if what I'm hearing you say correctly, has given rise to people who are ambassadors of this ideal of manhood that other men then become loyal to. Is that kind of what I hear you saying? Like there's a deep insecurity in the hearts of a lot of men about their place in the world that is leaving them maybe more vulnerable to some of these individuals? Okay.
It's leading them to be more vulnerable to that messaging for sure. And it's, I have a very soft spot in my heart for men who are struggling with this and are susceptible to these messages because they want to feel okay, right? And so you have people like Andrew Tate who are telling them that your place is naturally on the top of the heap. It's a natural thing. They make these appeals to nature to set up a gender hierarchy. And it feels good. It feels good to be told, oh, I'm supposed to be here, right? I'm supposed to be on top. This is just the way of the world. And it's not the way of the world. It's a way, it's not natural. It hasn't worked. And I will argue that, the folks who are most harmed by hegemonic masculinity are boys and men. Certainly everyone is. But when you look at it, it's heartbreaking to see how men die at higher rates than women at every age. And when you break it down, research shows it has to do with high risk-taking activities, which boys, especially young men and boys, feel the need to engage in order to perform their masculinity because it's a social construct, it's fragile, you have to constantly perform it. So drugs, alcohol, driving fast, all sorts of high-risk activities cause younger men to die at higher rates. And then you see men who are being asked to bifurcate their head and their heart, who don't seek the mental health that they need. So you see suicide rates of men many times the rate of women. You see men not seeking the mental health care they need. And you also see men not complying with physical health care to this. They don't go to the doctor as often, and when they do, they're not as compliant. So when you look at in terms of what they need to do to take care of themselves, so when you look at how masculinity harms boys and men, the data cannot be ignored. It is harmful to boys and men. And so I look at these messages from Tate and I think, who is being really profoundly harmed here? The men who are following them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very, when you look out across the landscape of our culture today through that more empathetic lens and really think about what are young women struggling with, the pressures they're facing, and then what are young men struggling with and the pressures they're facing. And, just to quantify sort of the vulnerability of young males, to your point, these high levels of suicide. And then so men are hurting, men are struggling, men aren't winning in this culture either, but getting underneath that of like what's going on there, and then how is whatever those feelings of insecurity and whatever that feeling of pain and a lack of ability to identify in this culture, those things that they're struggling with are leading them to find validation from people who, it just for me, in the case of Andrew Tate, it's so black and white. I'm like, this man is a trafficker. This man is using women. He subscribes to the lover boy strategy of getting women to fall in love with them by having sex with them and feigning this romantic interest, only to reverse the script and then have them prostituting for him. That level of manipulation, I go, how did we get somebody like him to become this, mentor to so many young males? So I think that's something, that I really appreciate your insight and your perspective on, and I'm still just really wrestling with that. It's something that's been happening recently. The last thing I really want to just kind of like touch base with you on, I don't know if you have thoughts. This year, the Barbie movie has come out. It's captured a lot of like the cultural interest right now, and has been getting a lot of attention. I'm curious, as we talk about these issues of representation and, issues just going on in the culture, what your thoughts are of that film and the message behind it.
I have so many thoughts. And if folks haven't seen Barbie, bring the tissue. It is not at all what you think it's going to be. It is a film that goes hard, critiquing sexual objectification. And spoiler alert, I think that's we can't talk about it unless we talk about the movie. But, Barbie comes from Barbie land to the real world, and she's sexually objectified and is pushing back against that and talking about the dehumanization of it in an exchange with some construction workers where she's saying, I don't know what you're saying, but it doesn't feel good. It doesn't basically make me feel like a whole human being. And I thought that was a really great message. Also, at the same time, she's wearing an outfit that is actually visually asking for sexual objectification. Not as bad as it could be, but so there's that complexity to it. I think, it reflects the difficult time that we have as a culture kind of really grappling with and moving away from the idea of women as sex objects. It also does this really interesting thing with masculinity where Ken has no power in Barbie land and is, I would argue, dehumanized and kind of, made subordinate and secondary and just doesn't matter at all, and then gets to our world where he realizes, men run everything. It's a patriarchy, right? Where men are in charge and men and what they do are more valuable than women and what they do, for lack, just to be simple about it. And then it's this revealing moment where gender roles, you switch the gender roles and it just becomes really obvious how unfair it is. And if we're really involved in fairness and want to live in a meritocracy, then we have to get rid of the gender binary and the way in which we construct gender hierarchies and gender roles. With that said, I'm going to be critical of the Barbie movie for a moment. And I will say, oh my goodness, Trojan horse, you got, patriarchy. The director gets patriarchy on the national agenda, a discussion about gender roles, a discussion of objectification, but ultimately returns to essentially a matriarchy, right? Where back to Barbie land, where women are in charge and men are still not given the same access. And there's this kind of tongue-in-cheek joke about, well, men aren't going to get seats on the Supreme Court in Barbie land, but maybe you'll get some secondary court positions. So one critique is it actually isn't great either way. Barbie revealed that a matriarchy doesn't make Kens feel good, and then when you go into a patriarchy, it doesn't make Barbies or women feel good, right? So let's reject both of those systems in favor of one that is more equal. That's not what happens in the film. Another is the individualization of the problem. So patriarchy is identified as an issue in our world using this really incredibly creative technique, the flip, right? But ultimately, Ken is still just finding out who he is at an individual level. Barbie is still finding out who she is at an individual level, free of these constraints. And really, it individualized what I think is a cultural problem, which is patriarchy. And so I love that the film identified the problem. I would say the solutions don't get us there.
Okay, that's helpful. That's helpful insight. I want to ask you, hearing you talk about the Barbie movie kind of raised one final question that I have for you. And I think this is an important one, just given, the relationships that I have with men. So some of what we've talked about today are things like men's violence against women, some of the depictions of what masculinity is presented to be about that could be very harmful towards women and also towards men and boys themselves. We've talked about the harm of some of these things, but it's difficult to talk about them without men feeling like it's anti-male. So I think there is this, there's maybe a growing anti-male sentiment in the culture, or at least the perception of one, that many men are sensitive towards. And so it's difficult to talk about really important issues that we need to talk about without getting these deeply existential, reactionary kind of responses. And that's why I come back to the point about Andrew Tate. Trying to provide a basic critique of him triggers this place where men feel like it's the eye roll, it's the, another anti-male, yada, yada, yada. And so I'm curious, in your work with students and young males, how have you been successful in creating conversations that allow for us to address and wrestle with some of the more harmful aspects of behaviors that we see men engaged in. Things like violence against women, for example, the creation of pornography that is all about the degradation of women, some of those kind of things. And then just this general performance of masculinity that's a total denial of one's humanity, like not having the right to be emotional, vulnerable, and only ever being strong and dominant and, angry is acceptable, but not compassionate, all that. How have you been successful at having conversations, bringing some of these things up without triggering those men who might feel like, because I just think the conversation warrants a bit of nuance. And I, for my part, don't know that I've successfully figured that out yet. So I'm curious what's worked for you.
I think it's really difficult anytime you're seeing certain groups make progress that by definition threaten the power of other groups. I think it's really difficult for the group in power to not be defensive regardless of how you deliver it. For example, the white supremacy system, which in simple terms is where we value white people and what they do more than people of color. I think we're seeing a terrible reaction to that, right? With trying to sugarcoat slavery, for example, in curriculum. I think that sort of ridiculous reaction is almost inevitable because what we're talking about is a real shift in power. And so I will say, I think it's really difficult to have a conversation about what needs to happen with our patriarchy and what needs to happen with gender justice and equity and fairness in terms of men and women and gender nonconforming folks, and not have the folks whose power is inherently threatened not feel defensive. So all of that to say, I think that's an inevitable part of a shifting social order. And in fact, it's a way that the social order pushes back and defends existing non-meritorious, I would argue, power dynamics. With that said, I've had extraordinary success on a one-on-one level because I truly care about men. And when you talk about patriarchy and masculinity, not masculinity writ large or many different types, but a very specific type of hyper traditional masculinity, the data is there that it harms boys and men. And I think starting from a position of empathy where recognizing that, yes, this benefits you in terms of power dynamics in society, and it benefits you in terms of making more money for the same work, and it benefits you in all of these, these social interactions and relationships and sexual interactions where you're on top of, you have more power. This is what it costs you. So starting from that place where, legitimately starting from a place of empathy, meaning truly caring about how it harms boys and men as well. Also, taking it away from the individual level, because this is a cultural issue, and it reminds me of the Hunger Games, where there's this moment where in the Hunger Games you have one player against another player, and Katniss is about to shoot a player, and he says, no, remember who the true enemy is. The enemy is the game master. The enemy is the culture. The enemy are the companies that are profiting off of these disputes and profiting off of our body hatred and shame and profiting off of gender roles. It's a remember who the enemy is. The enemy isn't men versus women. My goodness, we're all upholding these cultural these problematic cultural notions. The enemy is the game master.
Well said. These conversations are never light. The conversations that you and I have are always fraught with all kinds of triggers and nuance and complexity. And it's not easy to have these conversations. I'm finding it's getting actually more and more difficult. But I'm so grateful for you and the way that you so eloquently lay out the menu of issues that we're facing, both as men and women. And for anyone who's listening to this or watching this, I'm sure there are people who are going to be on both sides, agreeing and disagreeing. And one of the things that one of the values I've tried to embrace is the value of disagreement. I go, I value disagreement So let's still have the conversation, to invite people to the table because I feel like our culture has led us to this point where it's become so polarized that there's almost like this criteria of agreement before we can even have a conversation. And so my hope is really that people can hear the heart behind this conversation is our interest in a healthy culture, healthy men, healthy women, and looking at some of the things that are compromising that, and then the entities that are gaining from that. It's not us. Women aren't winning by these objectified images that are being mass produced, and that they're not gaining from that. Men aren't gaining from some of the things that are being presented about men. And so my hope through some of these conversations is that people will begin to wrestle with this, begin to think more deeply about it, hopefully begin to develop some of the critical thinking and media literacy that you're talking about, so that we can, deconstruct and move away from the more toxic depictions of what it means to be a man and woman in our culture that is leaving so many people just in horrible conditions. So thank you so much, Caroline, for coming and talking with me again. We've done this a few times. Anything in closing that is on your heart to share before we wrap this up?
Well, Benji, just to echo what you just said, really appreciate your work. And it's fascinating to me that we're having this conversation. You're approaching it from, a faith-based perspective. I'm a, hardcore atheist, radical intersectional feminist. And yet we have the overlapping concern about messaging and what that does, and in terms of the well-being of human beings. And also as someone, I just like to say, as someone who's studied gender and power dynamics for a few decades, if people think that they have some corner on truth and are really firm in a belief about gender power dynamics, I'd like to just disabuse people of that notion. It's so complex.
Yeah.
So anything that we're doing is kind of, pushing around in the dark, trying to figure out what's happening with trends so that we can provide some guidance to help folks along. But these are really complex topics. And I would just hope that as we are doing today, that people will listen to this with an open heart and an open mind and really be moved and let something in, instead of trying to, re-entrench whatever power dynamics they might be invested in.
I appreciate that so much. It's, I always approach these conversations with the perspective of curiosity. There's certain things that we go, child trafficking is wrong. Violence against women is wrong. Getting underneath that, getting into the layers, looking at the macro level, beginning to wrestle with the nuance of it all, trying to find solutions gets a lot more complicated. But if we're going to solve those things, if we're going to solve the child sex trafficking problem, if we're going to solve the epidemic of men's violence against women, we've got to stay curious, engage in these conversations, even when it makes some people feel uncomfortable. So thank you again. Our team Access Cry, we talk of you often. We have such deep respect for you. And so, it's just really an honor to have you back again. And I look forward to next time.
The feeling is mutual. Thank you so much.
You can check out all our podcast episodes, articles, and films at exoduscry.com. And join the daily conversation by following Exodus Cry on all major social platforms.